Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Bracken in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta, and I'm here to introduce our distinguished visitor for 2021-22, Professor Rebecca Comay, who is Professor of Philosophy and Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. That is the short introduction. We have a much longer introduction, which happened on Monday. This is the second of Dr. Comay's talks. I'll just show you how to get to recordings of these talks because they are being recorded. Just give me a minute here to mess with technology. If you want to register for events, or you want to view or stream events that have already happened, here's how to do it. Simply go to the U Alberta website, the English and Film Studies page, click on About, and then click on Talks and Speakers. And you will find registration links for events to come. And you will find links to YouTube recordings for events that have already happened. I'm going to begin by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe nations, lands now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and the homeland of the Métis. I'm not going to go into any further introductions because we did that on Monday. The title of Dr. Comay's talk today is Lumpendialectic, Tragedy and Revolution in the 18th Brumaire. And without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Comay to begin her talk. And I will mute myself. So, Dr. Comay, please.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody again for having me. It's nice to be back here again at my dining room table with you. Could we just have the first slide? Oh, second slide. Next. There we go. Okay. So last time I started setting up what I'm trying to set up, which is to be speaking about tragedy and dialectic, and I'm trying to speak about tragedy rather than the tragic, and dialectic rather than the dialectic, in order to return to both tragedy and dialectic. What I am proposing is their dramaturgical power, and this means to shift from a metaphysical conception of the tragic and the dialectic as a clash of principles, freedom versus necessity, blindness versus insight, etc., to a historical thinking where we can see what's happening is we're seeing in action the porosity or reciprocity between theory and practice. So the passage, I'm talking about the passage from theory to practice and back again. And I'm ultimately circling around this question of revolution. So without further ado, I'd like to launch into this talk. And if you could just do the next slide, because I want to just explain the structure of this talk, which is rather long and it's in 5 parts. So just so you, I'll flag when I'm moving from part to part, just so you don't, in case you're kind of dying, wondering when this is coming to an end. This is quite long. It's about it. No, just back to thanks. Okay, so my first section is, I don't need a slide, thanks. I'm not ready for a slide. Thank you. It's the slide above that I'll need eventually okay. So here's my first section, tragedy, dialectic, revolution, bringing these terms together. Can the category of the tragic be salvaged? If tragedy, like revolution, might seem irretrievably past its expiration date, and different reasons for this obsolescence have been continually offered from opposite ends of the political spectrum, my point is not to restore its grandeur, but to detonate what Benjamin called the revolutionary power of the outmoded. That is, to deploy the frayed remnants of tragedy so as to extract from obsolescence itself its explosive initiatory power. These tragic disjecta might prove to be the most stubborn remainders of the dialectic. Tragedy, revolution, dialectic, their tattered remnants are intertwined. If we were rag pickers, the salvage operation would go something like this: tragedy without fate, revolution without progress, dialectics without the conciliatory blandishment that have embarrassed it from the start. This surgical approach might seem rhapsodic and undialectical. For what it's worth, the scavenging began on Hegel's deathbed when the disciples gathered around the corpse and split themselves into old Hegelians and young, right wing and left wing, the Hegelita and the Hegelinga, the Hegelites and the Hegelists, and started carving up the corpus: rational kernel versus mystical shell, method versus system, the living versus the dead. So here's a counterintuitive gamble. Benjamin described himself as a gleaner, rummaging through the garbage of the 19th century as Freud sifted through the detritus of the dream. I shall purloin no valuables, he wrote, but the rags, the refuse, I'll let these come into their own by making use of them. Characteristically, Adorno objected to this scattershot method as being, in Adorno's words, insufficiently dialectical. But what of dialectic itself? What if it's the most moribund husks of the dialectic that prove to be its most serviceable remainder? I could have the first slide, please. That's the one with a lot of Greek on it. Oh, thanks. I'll be drawing on Aristotle's framework, hamartia, peripeteia, anagnorisis, even catharsis perhaps, but with one small caveat, which may turn out to be a large one. Aristotle famously contrasts poetry and history. He privileges poetry on modal or metaphysical grounds, whereas history deals with contingencies, things that merely happen to have happened, ta genomena, stuff that happened. Poetry deals with possibilities, ta dunata, the kind of things that could happen, hoia and genoito. So it's what could happen, it's the kind of thing that could happen. History speaks in the indicative, poetry in the optative. And that's why Aristotle considers poetry to be more philosophical, in his words, and more serious than history. It paints on a bigger canvas. To show that such a thing could happen, not merely that it did happen, but that it could happen, that it happens for a reason, is to recode an isolated event as a kind of event, hoion, a type of event, repeatable, recognizable, even generic. History acquires a genre. A person becomes a kind of person. Oedipus becomes Oedipal, Hamlet becomes Hamletian. The name ceases to function as a rigid designator. It becomes adjectival, normative, prescriptive. It nominates, it interpolates a person to a role, a title, an assignation, an institution. The name becomes more than a single person can bear. The specific magnitude of tragedy, that's okay. I don't need the slide anymore, thanks. The specific magnitude of tragedy, what Aristotle calls megathos, can in this sense be uncoupled from the prestige of its protagonists, from the loftiness of its storyline, or from any specific temporal or spatial duration or extension. And remember from last time, Aristotle's stipulations, the play has to be long enough to command our interest, short enough for us to take in and remember. It arises above all from the more of its counterfactual surplus. Tragedy is more philosophical because it is more. In bestowing on the event a nimbus of exemplarity, poetry raises this to conceptual dignity. This also implies, although Aristotle does not engage this thought, that such things might not occur, that possibilities might be thwarted or aborted. The passage from dunamis to energeia can be blocked, diverted, and even retroactively deactivated. Accomplishments can be incapacitated, past achievements undone. There can be a tragedy of non-realization and derealization. Revolution shows that history too has its poetry. They show history to be an archive of possibilities rather than a storehouse of facts. In exposing history to its own latency, revolution is a perfect example of mediated immediacy. A revolution is a paradigmatic hoion, a special kind of kind, one of a kind of one. Its singularity makes it repeat. In revolution, the mimetic structure of all action becomes explicit. So we have here mimesis to the second degree. Revolutionary action is at once an action and a representation or rephrasing of an action. Aristotle's genitive here swings both ways. I'm going to just hang on to this disreputable word representation for the moment. It's action that represents itself as action. Revolution is action that represents itself as action, that stakes a claim to action and redefines the meaning of action. Revolution is an exemplary action, a representative action, a cue and call for action. Revolutions spawn imitations because they are mimesis incarnate. As such, they suffer the ambiguity that besets all acting, as a claim to acting, that it might only be an impersonation of action, that it might be an act, the act of an act. Revolutions are dramatic. They make a drama of their doing, dran, not simply because they take place on such a grand scale or because they're always announcing themselves with speeches and spectacles. The spectacle itself marks the essential pivot between the act and its own recapitulation or rephrasing. So the storming of the Winter Palace needed its own storming of the Winter Palace. The repeated reenactments, the cinematic restaging, the photos, the movie stills, reproductions that would outstrip and upstage the original in scale and dramatic effect, and were sometimes taken as documentation of the event, and even as the event itself. This sometimes happened. Put even more simply, the revolution is never sans phrase. Collective action needs summaries, directives, signposts. History needs captions. This is the function of the revolutionary slogan, a topic that preoccupied Lenin to the point that he would actually take time out in the summer of 1917, then of all times, to write an essay on the language of slogans, while he kept issuing directives on the correct phrasing and timing, constantly adjusting their cadences to the shifting gusts of politics, issuing each with a precise release date and withdrawing it from circulation the moment its time expired. And that they have an expiration date is important, if only because they are historical and they mark history. All power to the Soviet, the United States of Europe, Soviets plus electrification, and so on. Insurrection is an art, says Lenin. Like any art, it must produce the conditions of its own legibility. It must simultaneously discover and generate its own public. Revolutionary action generates its own language, and language itself is a mode of action. Vulgar revolutionaries, remarks Lenin, fail to see, I'm still quoting Lenin, that the word is also a deed. Okay. That's him. That's the end of his quote, the quote. They underestimate the force of both speech and action, reducing the latter to blind motor innervation and the former to idle pedantry and prevarication. A slogan then is a pure performative, a microdrama within the drama, which is revolution. The slogan makes history in marking it. A revolution is itself a kind of slogan, a shortcut, a bit of shorthand. It abridges, it repeats, it circulates and travels. Revolutions condense and punctuate history. They mark the point where the totality flashes into view in the crystalline moment of decision, where history as a whole insists. That's why revolutionary dates and places acquire their explosive density, and also why their commemoration can be so dispiriting. Possibility surges into visibility when the organic fabric of history rips. Revolutions show that possibility is not a lump of positivity. It's not an inert potentiality awaiting actualization, not the unfurling of an entelechy, a bouquet of utopian promises, a rainbow of regulative ideas, or the receding horizon of an infinite task. That is the infinite deferred possibility, which is the paralyzing impossibility of the Kantian sollen or ought. To summarize that last sentence, what I just said very quickly, in Hegelian shorthand, and we are again sharply diverging from Aristotle, revolutions clarify the logic of what Hegel calls absolute modality. They demonstrate in a brutally concrete fashion why possibility isn't a given, but a result, a historical artifact rather than a natural capacity, a reflexive determination, to speak Hegelese again. Despite and because of their immediacy, revolutionary possibilities require mediation, a bristle of unpredictable obstacles and contingencies to become what they are. They are retroactively activated and at times disabled by what they enable. In short, the terms of freedom are never settled. And this is why revolutions come into such sharp focus from the perspective of their lapsing. It's as a missed or expired possibility, even an impossibility, that a revolution makes its most urgent claims. I don't mean by this to be trying to aggrandize failure or to sink into left-wing melancholia, but simply to question the self-evidence of success as the measure of revolutionary achievement. Freedom isn't a possession or acquisition that accretes temporally from generation to generation or expands geographically from center to periphery. And this obviously has post-colonial and decolonial implications. Failure, not success, may be the motor and method of revolutionary succession. That's why every revolutionary interregnum is so fraught, as Hannah Arendt noted. She was thinking specifically about the succession crises following the deaths of Lenin and Stalin, which she attributed to the special pathologies of totalitarianism, but we don't need to go that route to see the larger problem. A revolution throws the dynastic order of transmission and transition into disarray. It throws succession itself into disarray. So it's not out of some kind of cosmic or Sisyphean futility that revolutions keep repeating, that they stall and judder, constantly short-circuiting and lurching back to their starting point to start up all over again. There's a reason for this retroversion, namely that history can't wait. Paradoxically, it's impatience and not nostalgia that sets the clocks back. Revolutions don't advance by steps and stages, each picking up where the previous one left off. History doesn't progress, it doesn't accumulate, it doesn't wait. Every aborted revolution undermines the achievements of the preceding revolutions and the heroic narratives inspired by them. The history ripples backward until the entire past is shattered by its power. It's in this sense that Benjamin will describe revolution as an emergency brake. The locomotive of progress lurches to a halt. But time doesn't stand still in the revolutionary standstill. The shock introduces a reverse thrust into history, forcing a return to the beginning where everything must begin anew. The entire past must be smashed to rubble. Everything must start again, including the original beginning, which loses its foundational authority and ceases to be the beginning. The return to ground zero forces a complete reconfiguration of the political imaginary. It demands nothing less than a total reworking of the world. This is a melancholic, even perhaps a pessimistic finding. We can see here the death drive in action, but not a defeatist one. Pessimism must be organized, as someone said. In short, we could have the next slide, please. History has its tragic side. People make their own history, but not simply as they please. We might try, for fun, reading Marx's famous formula literally. Die Menschen machen ihre eigene Geschichte. aber sie machen sie nicht aus freien Stücken. History is something made, a facture, a fabrication, a fiction. Praxis is poiesis. Marx revises Aristotle to Arendt's everlasting annoyance. But this is productivity of a curiously inefficient and inhibited kind. History is a construction site, a place of bricolage, where the materials at our disposal are neither free pieces nor pieces of freedom. History is neither, I think we're done with the slide, thanks. It's neither a storehouse of industrial raw material, nor a treasure trove of inspiring examples from which to seek inspiration. It's rather a rubble heap of broken off initiatives, an unwieldy conglomerate of bits and pieces of unfreedom pressed together unfreely that goad and hinder our agency with the pressure of all unfinished business. We keep falling on snippets of interrupted performances from the past that impinge with a haunting insistence of half-forgotten melodies and shifting metaphors here. Stück can also mean a theatrical or musical piece or number, a shtick, so to speak. History is this stumbling. Praxis is parapraxis. The revolutions repeat, that the drama keeps replaying, shows something involuntary, mechanical, undignified, inhuman, even non-living at the core of human life. You might recognize here Bergson's definition of the comic, which has nothing to do with pleasure or happy endings, and is actually not that far from horror. We convulse with laughter, our own bodies becoming monstrously rigid and machine-like when we catch sight of the deadness encrusting, Bergson's horrible word, encrusting and interrupting the flow of life. Okay, now my second section, tragedy and dialectic in the age of counter-revolution. So we're already deep, as you may have noticed, in the 18th Brumaire. The workers' defeat at the hands of their supposed allies had triggered a cascade of retroactive defeats that stretched back to the beginnings of the revolutionary epoch. The disaster of June 1848, what Marx calls the ugly revolution, would prove to be neither an isolated accident nor a deviation from the glory days of 1789. The bloodbath spilled backward. It sustained the beautiful, Marx's words, the beautiful revolution of February 1848, the revolution of universal sympathy, when bourgeois and proletariats had briefly joined forces under the Republican banner. It would stain the July Revolution of 1830, already tainted by the mediocrity of its outcome. And the stain would keep seeping backward until it tarnished the foundational achievements and aspirations of 1789. It was no longer possible to represent the French Revolution as a half-finished project, a promise awaiting fulfillment, an ideal awaiting execution, the first act of a two-act drama. That had been once Marx's wager, first the political revolution, then the social revolution that would exceed and redeem it. First the revolution, then the other revolution, the second revolution, the revolution brewing within the revolution repeating, refuting, and outdoing itself, bursting through its own fetters. Marx had never lost sight of the vicissitudes of uneven development, or had assigned a fixed tempo or rhythm for this two-act drama. In Germany, still stagnating under feudal absolutism, the bourgeoisie had been so slow to develop that by the time it reached its own political maturity, Marx predicted that the workers would be hard on its heels. In the Communist Manifesto, he announced the long-delayed Republican prologue would be followed immediately by its proletarian sequel without pause for intermission. The events of 1848 ruined this scansion. The second act never came, or it came too early and was stifled before it could properly begin. In Cologne, Marx cautioned the workers to hold off on their bid to power until the bourgeoisie had secured their own, but it was too late. Terrified at the prospect of the workers' insurrection, the bourgeoisie stifled its own political ambitions and careened back into counter-revolutionary mode. But even in Paris, when the ground was well trodden, the time still wasn't right. Although the bourgeois revolution was by that point in its third rehearsal, the proletariat revolution still came too soon. It never would be the right time for revolution. The June debacle demonstrated that the revolutionary mantle cannot pass simply or smoothly from bourgeoisie to proletariat. The problem with the Republican Revolution was not that it had failed to measure up to its concept, that its universalism was truncated, to say the least, but rather that the concept itself was deficient. June 1848 exposed the intractable illiberalism at the heart of the liberal order. This would be confirmed by Bonaparte's landslide electoral success in the aftermath of the June massacre and his effortless coup d'etat 3 years later. In 1848, the Great French Revolution, all three words capitalized, the Great French Revolution dropped its aura. It wasn't that the legacy was usurped or squandered, that the copy didn't live up to the original. The declension from genius to idiot, from uncle to nephew, turned the hero into a fool, the ancestor into a pretender. It wasn't that little Bonaparte, as he was called, couldn't fill his uncle's shoes, but that his uncle couldn't fill them either. Like many an uncle before him, I'm just thinking of a few here, Creon, Claudius, Rameau, possibly even the divine Caesar himself, the uncle was already a usurper. This made mockery of Napoleon Bonaparte's, the first, the real one, claim to have finished the revolution in a glorious self-apotheosis. La révolution, c'est fini, said he. The revolution is concluded, finalized, fulfilled. Napoleon had to compare the completion of the French Revolution, to the conclusion of the novel. We finished the novel of the revolution. History must begin. The events of 1848 would unwrite the final chapter, turning the uncle's boast inside out. Actually, c'est fini. The revolution is canceled, liquidated, done in. The ambiguity of this endedness, completion, termination, allowed Louis Bonaparte to ride his uncle's coattails simultaneously in two opposite directions. Revolution and counter-revolution rolled into a single discordant extravaganza and enabled his overwhelming electoral and plebiscitary success. A cacophony of popular cries was heard across the country. Vive Napoléon, vive la République, over there. Vive Napoléon, abat la République, over here, kind of, and sometimes in the same place. Long live Napoleon, long live sausages. The tragedy of 1848 turned 1789 into a farce. This is tragic. The June Revolution marks a pivotal moment in the Marx-Hegel imbroglio because the stakes are sharpest. The debacle challenges the concept of universal progressive history and every model of the dialectic as a machinery of redemption. It troubles every notion of freedom as a possession or self-possession, a good that can be hoarded, distributed, divided, a treasure to be bequeathed. It highlights the paradox of revolutionary succession and troubles the measure of revolutionary success. And it raises the question of Marx's own Hegelian pedigree. All these questions will reverberate beyond 1848 and beyond Marx's own lifetime. Marx accuses Hegel, the great rememberer, of forgetting things, for example, about tragedy becoming farce. This may or may not be fair to Hegel, but the point is that Marx himself can't stop remembering. Still rehearsing his break from the now no longer so young Hegelians, unable to leave Hegel behind and uncertain how to turn the dialectic back on its feet, how to invert the speculative inversion, Marx keeps returning in this text to its weariest tropes and phrases. From its famous opening lines, the text is a tissue of quotations, allusions, citations of citations, translations of translations. Marx cites Hegel at least 4 times in the 18th Brumaire, if my count is right. The one time he mentions Hegel by name, though, is to tease him for what he didn't say, what he forgot to say, what he only half said, what Marx himself says, funnier and better. Hegel is brought in as the straight man for Marx's joke. I guess we can have the next slide. Except it wasn't really Marx's own joke. Heine had set it up. Hugo spun it out. Engels had written the first draft. The jest would keep the cartoon industry busy for many years. But having Hegel say it but not say it, Marx makes the witticism his own. He gets to claim his philosophical pedigree from Hegel while asserting authorship of what was by then a commonplace anyway. I guess we don't need the slide anymore, thanks. Why farce? A repeat performance of 1789, a diabolical inversion, counterrevolution masquerading in the faded insignia of the revolution. The travesty will reach its pitch when Louis Bonaparte assumes his uncle's name and nominates himself Emperor Napoleon III on December 2nd. December 2nd, 1852. Farce may not fully capture the scenario of doubling and double dealing, the cocktail of populism and authoritarianism, buffoonery and thuggery, violence and spectacle that would reach its peak in the Second Empire. Marx describes this tumultuous scene as a shadow theater, gray on gray, an endless twilight where despite or because of all the fireworks, nothing happens and everything remains the same. I'm just going to quote Marx in a slightly Yeatsian mood. Passion without truth, truth without passion, heroes without exploits, history without events, developments driven solely by the calendar and wearisome through constant repetition of the same tension and release. That's the end of that quote. That's how you put on a counter-revolution. Okay, so now I'm on to my third middle section, hypertaxis / parataxis. You probably just heard the bitter reference to Hegel's gray on gray, and it is indeed funny, sad to find it in revolutionary Paris, that color. But Marx's repetition of Hegel goes beyond citation and allusion. It operates at a more inconspicuous formal level of grammar and syntax. Form is never a merely formal matter. It gives expression to a real material impasse. 2 well-known examples will suffice for now. The first is flamboyantly, even hyperbolically dialectical, kind of wears dialectic on its sleeve. The second, brazenly undialectical. And in good dialectical fashion, they form a pair. The first is a passage towards the end of the 18th Brumaire, and we could have it up. That'd be good, thanks. Marx is describing the comeuppance of a class that has tossed away every one of its political gains to protect its economic assets. Knowing instinctively that it must forfeit the crown to save its purse, it must be prepared to relinquish democracy to safeguard its property. The bourgeoisie rehearses its irreversible exit from the political arena. So I'm just going to read over this kind of these wonderful sentences which you have before you. It deified the sword, now the sword rules over it. It destroyed the revolutionary press, now its own press is destroyed. It put public meetings under police surveillance, now its own salons are under police surveillance. It disbanded the Democratic National Guard, now its own National Guard has been disbanded. You get the point, but the repetition is important here. It imposed a state of siege, now a state of siege has been imposed on it. It supplanted juries with military commissions. Now its own juries have been supplanted by military commissions. It submitted public education to the control of the church. Now the church subjects it to its own education. It transported people without trial. Now it has been transported without trial. It suppressed every stirring in society by means of state power. Now every stirring in its own society is being crushed by state power. Okay, that's enough of that. Thanks. Thanks. So as history grinds to a halt, the dialectic start stuttering. Everything is reversing. Everything is turning around. Everything is collapsing in on itself. And yet, curiously, nothing is happening. Marx's syntax is as staccato as a fusillade, the dialectical machinery at its most unstoppable, spitting out its chiasms with industrial efficiency, everything lined up like links of sausage. Sorry about the mixed metaphor yet again. There's almost too much dialectic, reversal after reversal, circle upon circle, and yet the wheels just spin, the gears don't catch, the locomotive of history won't budge. Too much tragedy, and so no tragedy at all. Too much revenge, perhaps, and so no tragic justice served. This cascade of inversions harbors just the faintest echo of tragic peripeteia, and herein lies the farce. The bourgeoisie's reversals of fortune are unaccompanied by anagnoresis or recognition and yield no hint of moral uplift. Distracted from its historical assignment and blind to the significance of its concessions, the bourgeoisie is incapable of recognizing the stakes of its own downfall, and so cannot claim the role of tragic hero. And this misprision is structural. Parliamentary cretinism, as Marx unaffectionately calls it, expresses the ignorance specific to the liberal democratic form, but this blindness harbors a canny insight, namely that to maintain its monopoly on power, the bourgeoisie must dismantle this power. It would rather submit to total executive power than open the tiniest foothold to the working class. I'm going to read from Marx again. If in every stirring of life in society, it saw tranquility imperiled, how could it want to maintain at the head of society a regime of unrest? The parliamentary regime, this regime that lives in struggle and by struggle, the parliamentary regime that lives by discussion, how should it forbid discussion? The struggle of the orators on the platform evokes the struggle of the scribblers of the press. The debating club in parliament is supplemented by debating clubs in the salons and bistros. When you play the fiddle at the top of the stage, what else is to be expected but that those down below dance? And so parliament stages its own death warrant. It literally talks itself to death. Now, despite their formal similarity, there's a marked difference between the torrent of grammatical inversions that I read in the first passage and the bold dialectical reversals pulsing through Marx's early writings and surging to a climax in the Communist Manifesto. In that earlier text, written just on the eve of the 1848 revolutions, capitalism itself had been roiling with revolutionary energy, and the bourgeoisie had played the role of tragic hero, undoing itself in outdoing itself, hurtling unstoppably towards its own destruction. There's nothing tragic about the bourgeoisie's self-destruction after 1848. Marx describes the parliamentary implosion as in his words, a fizzle and a fade out, not a blow up, as verpufft, he says. Its departure from the scene of history has the anticlimactic finality of a stage exit that will, however, need to be incessantly repeated. There's no need to relate the tale of the ignominious disintegration, writes Marx, of the Democratic Republicans upon the collapse of the Constituent Assembly in May 1849. Their history, that history, has ceased forever. And yet they linger. Long after its political demise, the bourgeoisie keeps returning to the stage to replay the non-event of its own ignominious defeat. Decrepit, impotent, sans eyes, sans teeth, and so on. Those are Marx's Shakespeare's words. The snatch of half-remembered Shakespeare captures this senility. Defunct before having had a chance to reach maturity, the bourgeoisie keeps returning back to the stage as if it's forgotten or hadn't even noticed that its hour is over. Like Hunter Gracchus, it has missed the moment of its death. It went through all the motions, has even prepared its last will and testament, but having failed to name or acknowledge its successor, it falls into a testamentary vacuum and is condemned to live on past its expiration date, persisting only to testify to its own demise. There's something almost slapstick, almost Beckettian in this fizzling perseveration. It would possibly take a King Lear or someone like that to transform the indignities of senescence into a grand tragedy of overliving. And this accords generally with the gray on gray of the decor. The problem is not exactly useless or unemployed negativity in the sense of an untrammeled excess beyond the clutches of the dialectic. It's not that the machine isn't working, but rather that it's working all too well. It's in overdrive and caught in a frenzy of overproduction. In its prodigious hyper-efficiency, dialectic, history itself, the dialectic, history itself, has become threadbare and formulaic, wearisome, says Marx, through the constant repetition of the same tension and release. It keeps generating climaxes that turn out to be anticlimaxes, reversals that are empty inversions, contradictions that keep seizing and collapsing into the wooden binaries of the understanding. Antagonisms, quoting Marx again, that seem to work up into a climax only to lose their sharpness and fade away without resolution. Okay. In short, we witness the regression of dialectic to the bad infinite of what Hegel called the bad infinite of empty, endless oscillation. The crisis is only formally a crisis. It fails to demarcate, crinane, to detonate the antagonism that would catalyze real social transformation. The constitutional crisis of 1850, 1851 was in this sense a pseudo event, a turbulence serving to forestall revolutionary rupture. Insurrection within the limits of reason alone, Marx neatly puts it, and the Kantian illusion is suggestive. Dialectical contradiction has collapsed into the idle churning of antinomies that go nowhere, generate nothing, functioning only negatively to put a brake on reason and to protect the world from reason's onslaught. And this, for Hegel, was the ideological function, in fact, of the Kantian antinomies, which is to say the Kantian dialectic. It was, says Hegel, an excessive tenderness for the world that prompted Kant to suction off its own contradictions and to sequester these safely within the precinct of thought. The catastrophe then is that there is no catastrophe. The state of emergency has become the norm. Dialectical stammer is the dialect of the state of siege. So it's not simply that the machine is jamming or spewing out globs of inassimilable heterogeneity, as some Bataille or deconstruction inspired readers of the 18th Brumaire have argued. This was notably not actually Derrida's or Bataille's own approach to this text. Those readings are often inspired by Marx's diatribe against what he calls the scum, offal, refuse of all classes, that swarm of disjecta that keeps coagulating into a force of reaction, the class that is no class, leaking across class boundaries and threatening to erode the integrity and the agency of the once universal class. Workers who are not working, unemployed or unemployable, no longer or not yet integrated within the productive economy, consigned to the shadow economy or pushed into the criminal underworld, historical and geographical migrants caught in the temporal interregnum between feudal past and capitalist present, and in the spatial limbo between town and country, forced off the land, but unassimilated into the city, eking out a precarious existence at the margins of civil society, ejected or excluded from the proletariat while hollowing it out from within and bubbling to its surface as scum, Lumpenproletariat, which brings me to the second passage, which I guess we can have up already. Marx's exuberant description of what he calls this passively rotting mass has been deplored and adored in equal measure. It scandalizes for obvious reasons, which we can come back to. But this passage is often celebrated as an eruption of something weird and wonderful, a surge of wild, undialectical alterity, disaffected, discordant, dissident. The sentence visually pops off the page. Again, worth reading. Alongside decayed roués with dubious means of subsistence and of dubious origin, alongside ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, were, supplying for grammar's sake, vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged convicts, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, charlatans, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, which may be actors actually, Spieler, maquereaux, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars, dash. In short, the whole indefinite disintegrated mass thrown hither and thither, which the French call la bohème. I'll return to the formal in a minute, to the formal aspect of this congeries, only noting here that the Lumpen prefix is a vagabond signifier that eventually attaches to all classes: proletariat, peasants, bourgeoisie, aristocrats, Louis Bonaparte himself, chief of the Lumpen proletariat, ruining classification and the idea of class itself. It's impossible to identify a single feature uniting this motley group. And adding literati to the heap at the end doesn't clarify things, although it does remind us that someone is writing and reading these words. The umbrella term la bohème, with which Marx wraps up these series, in short, only adds another item to the series, producing yet another wrinkle of confusion. Marx's summary, in short, quotes in short, makes the list even longer. The promised summation again delays the end of the sentence, throwing it hither and thither, introducing another flurry of qualifiers that further frustrate the desire for a conclusion. Note also the kind of interrupting jangle of many foreign words in this sentence. And note finally that in German, the sentence is ungrammatical, lacking the minimal coordination of a copula. And that is the point. The Lumpen are the epitome of a community that has nothing in common. They are the force of disaggregation incarnate. What they share is a disaffiliation from every existing, that is to say, communal bond. Marx's exaggerated parataxis captures the systematic, what we can call the systematic, speaking psychoanalytically, attack on linking that defines the asocial sociability of this motley crowd. In their disconnection lies their indissoluble connection. In this respect, they're the exception that is the rule. Even while excluded from the privileges of civil society, they epitomize the atomism that defines the society. They embody the centrifugal force of the money they lack. That's why they're so easily absorbed into the counterrevolution, recruited to the military, bought off with sausages, cajoled into Bonaparte's coterie, or by whoever pays the price. And the rot extends from the Parisian underbelly to the swindlers at the top of the food chain, the stock jobbers, the landlords, the financiers, in whose unembellished corruption we revisit, in Marx's words, the rebirth of the Lumpen proletariat on the most prominent stages of bourgeois society. What unites these social extremes is the penumbra of so-called unproductive labor that sustains and shadows the industrial economy at both edges. This includes not only the service economy in the down market sense, I'm referring to sex workers, knife grinders, organ players, among the other people on that list, but the parasites at the top, the financial elite, whose sources of profit are drawn not primarily from the abstract, but nonetheless finite labor time of commodity production, but from the seemingly inexhaustible extraction time of rent, speculation, and interest. There's a superficial contrast between the hyperdialectical endlessness, what I was describing as the hyperdialectical endlessness of the chain of chiasmic inversions, and the undialectical endlessness of this list of disaggregated lumpen. But the effect of this hectic accumulation is in both cases the same. Both series deflate the suspense they generate through the relentless repetition. The tightly organized chiasmic syntax becomes aimless and paratactic through its relentless parallelism, while the string of disaggregated particles loses elasticity and momentum. But from this similarity will emerge a deeper contrast. The manifestly dialectical instance will prove flaccid and undialectical, while the seemingly undialectical instance may turn out to be the more dialectically robust. As a formal trope, let's just call it enumeratio, because I don't really know what to call it. Every list is modally and temporally ambivalent. It promises a future that it shuts down, releases the possibility that it simultaneously forecloses. It pivots, in other words, on the brink, on the edge between ideology and utopia. On the one hand, the list signals an abandonment of hierarchy, an opening to unforeseeable assemblages and solidarities, horizontal, metonymic, associative. One can discern in the artless wanderings of Marx's own beautiful run-on sentence, its rhythmic dilations, its juxtapositions, its wordplay and assonances, which you just have to read in the German to hear. This you can discern here the stirrings of a disavowed theatricality. That's the utopian promise. You never know what will come along next, whether the last item was the final one or just the latest one. Every new edition forces a retroactive reconfiguration of the whole series and a revision of its premises. And yet, and here's the ideological retraction, there's something listless and compliant in the very grammar of listing. The compulsive seriality of the list, one thing after another, forces an acquiescence to whatever happens to come along next. Unfettered by the constraints of grammar, the list instead draws attention to a tyrannical agency behind, before, or even in the words themselves. There's something or someone out there controlling the show, making you wait, like a steward dispersing the rations or a general mustering the troops. Or maybe it's just language that's calling the shots, implacably rolling out its items. Either way, narrative comes to a halt and the action freezes. Now, in traditional epic, the trope of the list is tied to the assertion of imperial triumph, the catalogue of ships, the military parade, the display of captives and spolia. The halt is temporary and serves a narrative marching towards a victorious finale. Marx's catalog, then, has a distinctly anti-epic feel, dilatory, disorganized, disaggregated, more akin to rag picking than to military muster. It presents a stasis that threatens to derail the march of history, a heap of bodies that won't work, an assemblage that won't add up to a collective, a class that won't take class action. And we can also see this list as a parody of bureaucratic reason, a kind of anti-catalog, an inversion, which is actually an inversion of contemporary attempts to introduce disciplinary order on a workplace threatened by delinquency and on a nation threatened by dissidence. This is, as Marx is writing, the age of censuses, registries, charts, tables, tallies. It is the age of lists. Raymond Williams and Mark Neoclaus have both drawn a connection between the birth of statistics and the birth of the modern state. The obsession with data crunching, reflecting the difficulties representing a social body that was becoming increasingly opaque, inscrutable, and unmanageable, literally unknowable even to itself. An influential survey from not that long after, from 1870, will try to sort out the different types of workers according to their habits at home, work, and at the wine bar, and sort of listing all the gradations from the industrious, cooperative, married, sober, thrifty, church-going, good workers, to the debauched, carousing, unruly, disrespectful, uncooperative, contrary-minded, songwriting and singing sublimes. Sweeping up all these undesirables into the swoop of a single run-on sentence, Marx skims off these not really working workers from the ranks of the proletariat proper. His description resonates badly, unfortunately, let's say, with descriptions of the so-called dangerous classes, the vagrants, prostitutes, criminals, social deviants, and ultimately simply the poor themselves in the reactionary press and popular fiction. The crucial difference being, of course, that for Marx, the danger of these individuals is precisely that they pose no danger. Far from presenting a threat to the regime, they buttress it. And now my second from the last section is called Enter the Revolution. But what are the revolution? But what are all these people doing on the stage, and where are all the others? As the word suggests, farce is the overstuffed genre like Bonaparte sausages that stretches to contain multitudes. Hence the multiplication of actors, accompanied by a shrinkage of good speaking parts and by the bombast of a player king stupid enough to take his comedy for world history. The pageant explodes into a carnival of minor characters while the real historical actors are swept off stage. Removed from visibility, massacred on the barricades, exiled, incarcerated, disorganized, pacified by temporary affluence, soon enough ejected from the city center by gentrification, the workers have retreated to a shadowy offstage arena, another scene, so to speak, invisible, inscrutable, unknown perhaps even to themselves. The revolutionary so-called subject of history, to use this Lukácsian term, which is never, to my knowledge, used by Marx, no longer appears in person, neither as a collective personality nor as a dramatic persona. It's no longer the bourgeoisie, which has regressed from its glory days and quivers before its own revolutionary past. It's not yet the proletariat, which has retreated to a murky offstage existence. It's not yet the peasantry, which is mired in nostalgic imperial reveries while buried under an avalanche of modern rents and taxes, as disaggregated and undifferentiated as, to cite Marx's infamous phrase, as a sack of potatoes, literally windowless in their hovels, like monads, sans pre-established harmony. And Marx has abandoned hope in the ragged multitude as a force of revolutionary practice. Everyone is offbeat and out of time. All have arrived too early or stayed too late for the revolution. All have missed their entrance or exit cues. Both time and space are out of joint, chopped up and reassembled in unwieldy combinations of past and present, town and country. Industrial capitalism is both lagging behind and overleaping its epoch, still haunted by the residues of feudalism, while already pressing forward to speculative financial adventures. The ongoing drama of primitive accumulation is taking place beyond the factory floor, in the bankers' chambers, in the notaries' offices, in the stock exchange, where one can speculate on the price of Californian gold without ever having to leave town. The revolutionary drama, then, will have to play out beyond the factories and barricades, in abodes even more hidden than the hidden abode of production, in the streets and in the countryside, in the colonies, where the class struggle churns invisibly in plain sight. No longer a French revolution, because indeed it never actually was one. I'm editorializing here, by the way. On the expanded stage of a world still to be made. Marx does not, in this context, go so far as to speak of a world that is larger than Europe, or of a revolution that's larger than a pan-European revolution. But let's extrapolate from the gist of what he actually is saying. Marx declines to give a name to this obscure revolutionary agency, opting for the revolution, which obviously is capitalized in German because everything else is, but in English it deserves it, I think correctly is capitalized, the revolution, as personified agent of history. Personification might not capture an agency that is straining the category of the human. It turns out to be a small, hungry animal that's doing the work. And work might not quite describe this blind, aimless, voracious, destructive toil. And now we can get the next slide, I think. Thanks. But the revolution is thorough. Gründlich is the word. It's still on its way through purgatory. It goes about its business methodically. By 2nd of December, 1851, that's the date of the coup. It had completed half its preparatory work, and now it is completing its other half. First, it developed parliamentary power in order to overthrow it. Now that it has achieved this, it's developing the executive power, reducing it to its purest expression, isolating it, confronting it as its sole antagonist in order to concentrate all its powers of destruction against it. And when it has completed the second half of its preparatory work, so we're still not yet at the second half of the preparatory work for the revolution. When it's halfway through the preparation, Europe will jump up and cry out, "Well-grubbed old mole." And we can return, if anyone wants to, Marx's kind of sly emendation of Hamlet. With the manifest, that's good, thanks. With the manifest hypertrophy of executive power, counterrevolution condenses into a single unified opponent, a sole antagonist against which the revolution can rally its forces. Marx thus embraces the coup for its unvarnished display of power. The tragic binary reasserts itself as the decisive standoff between two clearly opposed antagonists, a simplification, clarification, cathartic purification of the class struggle where it seemed most opaque and uncertain, where dialectical negativity had kept dissolving into a semantic fog of disaggregated differences or fissuring into a syntactic maze of useless inversion. Marx retrieves antagonism at the point of its greatest attenuation. This is, I'm quoting him, the dangerous turn that transforms every struggle against state power into a struggle against capital itself. Politics then becomes the essential locus and focus of class struggle, which is a pretty, huge revision. The impediment to revolution turns out to be its enabling condition. Not too much longer. But who or what is the revolution? The opaque abstractness of the noun mirrors the motley concreteness, which is, of course, just another kind of abstractness of the teeming Lumpen. But the abstraction is a real one. The disconnect is materially generated and experienced. It registers the difficulty of defining or claiming political agency in a world where the terms of action are changing. The challenges are practical, tactical, organizational, but they're also representational and aesthetic. They pertain to the scalar slippages at work as the theater of operations is changing. What is a revolution? What are its ends and limits? When does it start and stop? How do you know it when you see it? Where does it go when its players are dispersed, exiled, or driven underground? What is the difference between interruption and determination, between fatigue and exhaustion, between failure and defeat? How long can an intermission keep going before it ceases to be an intermission? How long is purgatory? What happened to Hamlet's father? What is a tragedy when the stage is too empty or too crowded, when there are either too many players, and I think this problem is rehearsed in Euripides, or not enough? This problem is explored in Beckett. How do you represent a subject whose edges seem to both exceed and undershoot the limits of subjectivity? How do you represent a collective protagonist? Is there such a thing as a collective protagonist? What is revolution in the absence of a clearly defined revolutionary class? This is less, I think, the structural causality of what Althusser calls a process without a subject than it is a process in search of a subject that is generated in and by the search itself. There is no class consciousness, and therefore no class prior to or outside the class struggle. Character is subordinate to plot. Marx pushes Aristotle's poetics to a point of Nietzschean extremity. There is no doer behind the deed. The agent of revolution then is the revolution. This is not the first time the revolution has assumed the corporate dignitas of a quasi-person. It acquired its majuscule just as soon as it was registered as a revolution in the first place. That is, when the multiple upheavals erupting spontaneously across France in 1789 coalesced into a singular event, a revolution, turning rapidly into the revolution, the one and only, unprecedented, unrepeatable, and yet perpetually renascent, fons et origo of subsequent revolutions, the charismatic object of transference in an unending tragedy of succession, betrayal, usurpation. Revolution itself is the ultimate lost object. Abstraction does not soften or compensate for the real vicissitudes of loss, because abstraction itself has the sharpness of a real severance or tearing. And so the loss of an abstraction is a loss of loss, a doubling and intensification. This is why, as Freud reminds us, the loss or disappointment in seemingly undefinable, intractably opaque, or unknown objects can trigger the most powerful and most rageful melancholia. But why is the revolution playing the role of old Hamlet? And who will take on the role of avenger? That old script might not augur well for the future of revolution. For the young Hegelians still stuck in the waiting room of history, lamenting a revolutionary modernity that was not theirs to inherit, Germany was Hamlet. That phrase was coined by them. Inaction, indecision, overthinking. Marx pushes forward. We could have the next slide, I guess. When it has completed the second half of this preparatory work for Arbeit, Europe will leap up and cry out, I'm still quoting, obviously, well-grubbed old mole. The applause might seem premature, given that by Marx's own reckoning, the play has barely begun and the main protagonist, the revolution, has yet to make its appearance. But everything is in medias res. Revolution is not a finished artwork that we can observe from on high. We've arrived, and we will always arrive late for the first act, and the end will be still outstanding, which is another way of saying that we are participants in history and never simply observers. The preparation for the drama is part of the drama, and the audience's reaction is part of the action, which is again to say, in another way, that we make history, but not under circumstances of our choosing. We are hobbled by the dead weight of ancestors and by the demand of future generations who may or may not applaud us. This ruins the possibility of any so-called Aristotelian, so-called unity of action. The leap of the imagined audience springing to its feet recalls the salto mortale that Marx had gestured toward earlier in the essay when he adapted Hegel's formula of reconciliation into an activist injunction, hic rodus, hic salta. But the location of revolutionary roads is uncertain. There is no here. Like old Hamlet scrabbling beneath the stage floor, the revolution is hic et ubique, both here and over there, wherever, not everywhere, and not just anywhere, but not only here, somewhere other than here, at a time and place still to be determined. And I have just been borrowing from, and cannot recommend highly enough, Sam Weber's wonderful parsing of the grammar of this spectral adverb, ubique, in the ghost scene in Hamlet. And now I'm at my final, we can take that away, and I'm at my final and shortest section, Lumpendialectic. In his postface, his afterword to the 18th Brumaire, after Marx has died, Engels will praise Marx's ability to parry the slings and arrows of revolutionary misfortune. Nothing surprised Marx, he writes. The theory of historical materialism has, again quoting Engels, brilliantly withstood the test of history. The great laws of motion remain in force. Engels' assurance might come as a surprise, given that almost everything recounted in the 18th Brumaire seems to have singularly failed that test. But you can see how someone arriving at the end of the day or end of the play might come to this conclusion. It's too soon to accuse Marx of philosophical wizardry of a kind of vulgar Hegelian sort, wresting victory from defeat, peddling the threadbare remains of providential eschatology, what Dühring will call the old Hegelian crutch. It turns out that the reactionary excrescences that had been sabotaging the machinery of revolution were all this time oiling it. The forces that had been corroding class integrity proved to be agents of class unification. Even the superannuated bourgeoisie turns out to have been working overtime in the service of the revolution. Why? Because in capitulating to state power, they cast a spotlight on its omnipresent violence. This is the cunning of reason at its most enterprising. The corpses of the insurgents can finally be consigned to the slaughter bench of history as collateral damage. The impediment to revolution turns out to be its enabling condition. The bourgeois revolution is dead. Long live the proletariat revolution. For Hegel, the old mole was, of course, the providential figure of reason in history, the motor of spirit's inexorable movement toward the sunlight. It was a possibly perverse choice of animals on Hegel's part, if only because sunlight is exactly what a normal, regular mole avoids. Nocturnal and light shy, a mole has an almost unlimited capacity for underground existence and every reason to avoid surfacing. It knows that dusk is the most dangerous time to break ground. Is an easy prey for owls. But spirit moves at different velocities above and below ground. There's a difference between the deep geological time, or what we might call the unconscious, and the rapid time of organization and decision where pacing and timing are all. The revolution is gründlich, says Marx, thorough, methodical, but also subterranean with its own peculiar rigor, digging deep into the past, mining the depths, tunneling underground, undermining foundations. Engels, who had fed Marx the tragedy farce meme, had joked about old Hegel, stage managing the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the man from beyond the grave. And what one might wonder if the same might be true of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the text of Marx. Is dialectic a deus ex machina brought in at 0 hour? Is it the stage crew? Is it the chorus commenting on the confusing spectacle? Is it the ghost in the machine? Is it the machine itself? I'm so near the end. Dialectic is the motor of history and suffers the vicissitudes, that is, the untimeliness of all things historical. It can become creaky with overuse and stale through habit. Its own motility can be the greatest impediment to change. Running on overdrive, it can be mobilized without being fully assimilated, falling behind itself, becoming its own remainder, a shadow of itself, gray on gray, a shadow authority, an éminence grise, the dialectic. Marx compares the challenge of assuming revolutionary freedom to the difficulty of learning a new language. The sign of fluency is when you can forget the old one, when you find yourself moving around freely in your adopted language, unencumbered by the reminders of your mother tongue. Repetition, then, would be a symptom of a hyperactive memory and a moribund imagination. But repetition is also the best way, maybe the only way, past a certain age at least, to learn a new language. You recite meaningless syllables, you make lists, you idiotically keep repeating it until it trips naturally off your tongue. You chop it into pieces, you turn a living language into a dead language so that it can become a living part of you as if you never had to learn it. And repetition can also be a way to unlearn an old language. Keep saying the same word over and over until it becomes weird and incomprehensible. Keep repeating the most tired phrases until they become mysterious and opaque. Marx is not one to write recipes for the cookbooks of the future. Every historical construction must be cobbled together from the detritus of the past. Included among the ready-mades is the flotsam of a dialectic that has become paralyzed with overuse. A mere phrase to just pull out one of the many phrases that Marx sprinkles throughout the 18th Brumaire, a mere phrase, an empty phrase, a form, a formula, a clone and parody of itself, a hollowed out signifier, an empty shell or husk. In mechanically repeating Hegel's words and syntax, Marx makes them strange. He keeps the machine idling while the new one is being forged. It may take this to extract the poetry of the future from the gray on gray of capitalism, a world in which all theory is, I'm quoting Marx. This is a joke. A world in which, quoting Goethe, a world in which all theory is gray and only business is green, said Marx once. I'm finished my talk. We can have one more slide, please, just to, maybe another one just for fun. One more, and then we can stop. Okay. All right. I'm done.
Thank you, Rebecca, for another amazing talk. I can't remember the last time I listened to someone read something that carefully and that closely. Generally, at the University of Alberta today, we stumble from one administrative crisis to another without any time to think or regroup. I wonder if we're having our own 18th Brumaire, but I won't pursue that thought. So just to remind everyone, we're in a Zoom webinar. We're not in a Zoom meeting. There's no chat, but there is Q&A. And Q&A is a bit laborious, but some of you are really on top of this. So we already have 2 questions, and they're kind of substantial. The first is from Christopher Chapman. I will not attempt to read this. I'm going to give Rebecca a chance to scroll through it. And I'm actually just going to use this opportunity to give her a minute to recuperate and read. And I'm going to plug her next event by sharing my screen, which is not that easy on Zoom webinar. Let me do this. There we go. So Rebecca's next event will be office hours tomorrow, beginning at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, or Mountain Daylight Savings Time, if you want to get technical. If you want to book an appointment, email artsevents@ualberta.ca. Okay. You can get all of this information again through our event page, which I guided you towards at the beginning of this meeting. And again, you can get the big introduction presented by Karen Ball on Monday, March 21st, by following the March 21st YouTube link, which I tried to guide you towards at the beginning of this talk. Okay, Rebecca, are you ready to take now 3?
I don't know if I'm exactly, but whose question is this first one? Maybe
Christopher Chapman.
Maybe would it be helpful for Christopher talk? Can he?
Okay. We'll have to ask our technical people.
So if he could use his mic, that might be good. So the question is, because I guess the people can't see the question, can they? No, the rest of the people, no. Okay, so the question is whether Zelensky.
Yeah.
I'm going to read the question so that people can hear it. I wonder if this is Christopher. I wonder if we might be able to conjugate the figure of Zelensky as he stands on the world stage today. Is Zelensky a tragic figure, as Benjamin theorizes it, speaking the language of silence under the expectation of being flung into a future formed by a distant community that will retroactively make clear the spasmodic temporal progression that tragedy presents? Or is he an intriguer, a master of confusion, choreographing a mystical global general strike? The former presumably reinscribes, I'm still reading, a Ukrainian parliament, the latter impossibly a new global utopia. So that's such an interesting question. So you've just contrasted, I mean, the alternative, is he there? The alternative seems to be, one part of the question is what we're, what we're watching.
But can I interrupt? So Christopher should be able to speak now.
Okay. So you're asking whether what's happening right now in Ukraine can be thought of as a tragedy or a kind of Benjaminian Trauerspiel, where the leader, whether the leader is a tragic hero.
Hmm.
Okay, tragic.
I'm
king.
I'm just thinking
Or-
about the moment
or a Baroque kind of intriguer. I'm intrigued because you're putting more revolutionary potency, or utopia. I shouldn't say revolutionary, maybe even utopian potency into the latter. Is that right? And I'm kind of intrigued by that. Why you would say that? I mean, are you saying that?
Yes. I guess I'm rereading Critique of Violence towards a critique of violence and thinking about it. And I've just lighted upon this wonderful talk that you've just given, and it informs that greatly. Basically, and I'm reading background information articles around it. In essence, there's two forms of violence that Benjamin is advancing. The first being mythical violence, which founds a law, and it's sort of it's a bloody violence. There's a second kind of violence that some commentators describe as mystical or divine violence that Benjamin is attracted to in the form of the idea of a general strike, where instead of taking action, precisely the opposite occurs, where we agree to do nothing. and there's something beguiling, I mean, that's the wrong word, but there's something beguiling about that idea, given what Zelensky has asked us to do today, to come out of our offices and our homes and our places of employment and protest. It seems as if he's less concerned with trying to refound Ukrainian democracy than he is in trying to form a new order. and I'm at sixes and sevens about the implications of what that might mean, even if I'm deeply sympathetic to his call.
I'm a little bit puzzled by you're saying. I mean, you're wondering whether you're saying that this is a moment to be worrying about democracy. I mean, that this sort of responding to the actual state of emergency is somehow comparable to other indications of a state of emergency, such as Weimar Germany or 18th Brumaire.
It seems to precisely enact the thesis of your talk. First is tragedy, second time is farce. He's now asking us to stand in front of a tyrant, and it's I don't have the answers. This is too quickly on the bubble, but it's such a timely discussion of this question, and I'm trying to parse out what Zelensky might mean on the world stage today. Is he a tragic figure, or is he a combiner, or as Benjamin described? And how can I think that through in the terms you've provided today?
Right, and just with the proviso, I guess, that I don't think either tragedy or Trauerspiel are necessarily stable terms that that we have to adhere to.
No,
the definition of anybody, like Aristotle or Benjamin or anybody else. I think I'm hearing what you're asking in the question itself. That's really interesting. I'd have to really it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
I felt I had to ask, however.
Yeah.
I'll call to ask the question. It seems we need to.
Yeah, thanks for thanks for bringing us into.
Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so attendees can now raise their hand and join through audio. But the next question on Q&A is from Adam.
Should I read it? Okay, I'll read it so that people can hear it. So Adam Takash is that, if that's how you pronounce your name, is not the motif of, is not the motif of violence the essentially non-dialectical tragic moment of all revolutions? Is it not the lack of this that makes the French Revolution of 1848 a farce for Marx? The term violence is virtually absent from Marx's Brumaire. And isn't this what Lukács's example of the transition from the so-called metaphysics of Lukács's term, metaphysics of tragedy, to the affirmation of revolutionary violence in 1919 ultimately alludes to?
And by the way, Adam can.
Were these questions written in consort? So I guess, so I would push back a little bit in separating violence from dialectic, or separating dialectic from violence. Why is, I would never want to claim that violence is essentially non-dialectical, or that I guess I'm the thrust of what I'm trying to think about is whether there's something in the dialectic of revolution, which is bound to its tragic character, is not necessarily the bloodshed spent by the revolution, but this, which may accompany it, but it's the history of violence, the long history of violence, which is the occasion for the revolution in the first place, which revolutionary violence, is the kind of condensation and punctuation of that violence. And so the carryover of that violence into revolution and post-revolution, I mean, that is part of the tragedy. I would call that, I would say that's the dialectical kernel of revolution. I mean, and that's what makes it, such a, so in need of constant iteration. So, but I'm not sure that I'm getting your question though. So
Adam can speak if you want.
Yeah. Why don't you speak?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Basically, there's two questions here. Really, I just squeeze them into my remark, and that's why it doesn't make full sense. The first question is really simple: that why do you think that the term violence is absent from Marx's text? So, if it's the kernel of dialectics, and if it's, as you say, it is the essential vehicle of all revolutions, that why is not appears at all, basically, in the vocabulary of this text, in the conceptual framework of Marx? That's the first, I think, simple question. The other one is maybe it's more tricky if you're right and to say that violence is the essential motive for revolution, then it's kind of difficult to see what's the difference between non-revolutionary social situations and revolutionary social situations, because violence, symbolic violence, in the form of exploitation and oppression, it's an integral part of daily life in any society, according to Marx. So compared to that, the bloodshed or the actual physical violence would not be qualitatively different stage of social situation. So if violence is everywhere, then why the revolutionary situation would be any different from the non-revolutionary situations? I think we can only avoid this by affirming that there is a different type of violence in revolution, qualitatively different. And then I simply just would say that it would be difficult to distinguish this other type, this novel type of violence in revolution from the notion of tragic. This is a failure, basically. If there's a new type of revolutionary violence in a revolution, then it's in a way precisely the a priori failure of every revolution. The fact that we cannot imagine a revolution without violence, it signs its ultimate failure. in a way, that's very much the ultimate failure of life situation is what Lukács called a tragic moment of life. So that's how my line of thought was unfolding. I wonder if I made myself more clear this way.
Yeah. This connects to the previous question too, concerning the question of two kinds of violence. The previous person Christopher wanted to talk about Benjamin's critique of violence, and then with its, with its own bifurcation between mythic violence, which is state founding, state maintaining, state reinforcing, et cetera, and what he calls the divine violence, which actually undoes the form of the state. And we don't have to get into that now, but that there might be two entirely different kinds of violence, which makes the revolution, it makes revolution, I should say, discontinuous with the everyday violence to which it's a response. Does not have to mean that there are kind of empirical, there's empirical qualities that demarcate this violence as being inherently revolutionary, or that violence as being inherently counter-revolutionary. I mean, violence doesn't wear its, it doesn't wear its meaning on the sleeve. It needs interpretation. It needs historical elucidation. It needs experience. So I don't think there's anything inherent about bloodshed that makes it revolutionary or counter-revolutionary at all. I think it just nor do I think that there's something inherently there's a quality by which one can identify what is the revolution. Is it something that happens quickly, or is it something that involves killing a lot of people? But I don't think we're talking about that kind of event. So So Marx doesn't talk very much about violence. I mean, he doesn't not talk about violence actually in the 18th Brumaire. He doesn't in the text to go to though, because 18th Brumaire is talking about the aftermath of June 1848. He's talking about all the events that led up to the coup, in 1851, and then everything leading up to what's still at the periphery of this text, which is the Napoleon's seizing of taking the founding making himself emperor, right? But so the text to look at though is the class struggle in France, which is just a little bit earlier, which is talking precisely about the slaughter of June, the violence of June, which is the decisive, which is when the revolution just swung into counter-revolution, when the bourgeoisie and the proletariat just kind of split apart, and the bourgeoisie basically, the proletariat got slaughtered. So that's what he calls the ugly tragedy, which has which at that point, still had he was writing when he was writing, he's writing journalism. It's like he couldn't see into the future, but at that point, he saw a possibility that is much more difficult to see in the 18th Brumaire, when we find this kind of whole consolidation and of a state form which has become which is really seems to be going its own way and taken on a life of its own. And this is the almost, this is a complete hypertrophy of executive power. It's just not something that was in the cards then. So the state violence and the violence that is the state becomes, much more clear in the 18th Brumaire. And this is why, we need a different set of analytic tools. But I would not want to say that there's inherently anything about revolution. or a priori violent or doomed. I think that's what we have to not say.
Right, right, I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Ricky.
Ricky, hi Ricky.
And Ricky can join
Yeah, I know.
in audio.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
It's been a while.
I know.
I just, I mean, as I wrote my question there, I just had a question about the relationship between revolution and time. I mean, you kind of invoked Floyd and deadline, so I was just wondering if you could expand a bit more about it. What the relationship between revolution and time is, and how that plays out in what you mentioned at the end of your talk about repetition. But I'm thinking kind of analytically, but I'm also trying to think about it in a philosophical sense.
Well, you picked up on something. Ricky is a psychoanalyst, by the way, so something behind this question, I think. I think you picked on something, some kind of fast footwork I was doing in the last little bit of my talk, when I brought in the deep time of psychoanalysis in relation to the old mole, which seemed the old mole. The analogy seemed to being that the old mole is not subject. He's not. The old mole is not following a schedule, it's following its own itinerary. Not that it has all the time in the world, but it needs to take the time it takes. And that in that respect, that's that was my analogy to psychoanalysis, that, it needs to take the time it takes, even while, because the unconscious is timeless, not in the sense that it's eternal or changeless or anything else, but it does not obey the calendar. And the paradox, I think, that psychoanalysis is dealing with all the time, and the revolutionary practice is dealing with all the time, is that there is both. The similarity would be that both are, having to are mobilizing these two very discrepant forms of temporality. So the revolution is, the old mole has to take its time. The revolution, doesn't perform on schedule. At the same time, schedule matters. Like things have to be called, and the slogan has to be revoked, and that the dates and times are really, really important. And the same way that you have to show up, at the same time for your appointment and leave after 50 minutes. So it's this kind of intrusion. That's the kind of paradox that both seem to embody. This kind of intersection of regular Newtonian workaday time of the clock and this time that needs its time. So in that respect, that's what I would say with respect to your time question. Is that what you're?
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I was trying to think about with respect to, what does it mean to kind of temporally or using time to kind of explain kind of revolution, both in a historical sense or a philosophical sense, but also in the context of what happens in analysis, and there's something powerful that happens in analytic clinic that is kind of akin to revolution, but it has a different sense of register. It has a different set of parameters and historical events. And so I've been trying to think about the relationship between historical events and what happens in the analytic clinic. And I think you answered that quite well. Thank you.
Yeah, and you still have to kind of pay the bill on time. And
exactly.
If you're not in Ontario, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so Karen has a question, and I think we're going to let Karen in to ask it live.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So I'm gonna read my question because then it's less.
Karen, did you mute yourself?
I can't hear anything. Is she there?
I'll unmute myself. Okay. So I just lost my question. I'm gonna see if I can get it back up.
Want me to
here.
read it to you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that's Karen. I am thinking that the play of implotments between Hugo, Proudhon, and Marx might be read as posing a question or challenge to the dialectic that I hear your talk as both articulating and answering. The question, to clarify what you're doing with the imaginary and dramaturgy, oh yeah, the question just popped away, of revolution, I'm hoping you would elaborate a bit more on how you are conceptualizing loss here and how it relates to the motif of bourgeois disavowal in the 18th Brumaire, i.e., no, is the loss post-structural, i.e. a loss of referential plenitude, especially given the problem representing collective consciousness, or does it have more to do with disavowal, or perhaps both at once? That's so many questions, Karen.
I'm so sorry.
No. So walk me through them.
Okay.
Like, or one so we can kind of work with them. Would you mind?
Okay, sure. I can start my video now.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm obviously there's a lot of interferences that I'm having while I'm listening to you from Zizek and but also from my former mentor Hayden White, thinking about implotment and so that's part of the milieu of the question. I hope that I didn't put it too pretentiously. And I was wondering because Marx talks about first as tragedy and then as farce, which of course makes us not be able to see the tragedy anymore. Once you see it as farce, you can no longer see it as tragedy, perhaps. But it also depends on your, political positionality, I guess. It's also striking that Marx talks, he doesn't obviously use a psychoanalytic term disavowal, but he is really talking about bourgeois disavowal as something that is somehow separating and yet also bringing together the two implotments. That in both cases we're looking at some sort of characterization of a collective or an agent that that allows another group to narrate it so that they don't have to deal with the reality of it, or they don't have to deal with their own implication and the suffering that it causes. Given that the motif of staging and in your talk and in your previous talk, and the way that is itself also to some extent a metaphor for the notion of the imaginary and how we play out images of events as we're remembering them or as we're fantasizing about them. I was.
Or can I just add something? Or as we're acting them, as we're doing them.
Yeah. I just, there was all these elements that seemed to come into play, and then there seemed to be an anchor in this concept of loss, which I think I lost track at that point of from whose point of view the loss is taking place, and it may be just because my presence of mind isn't perfect, so maybe it's not something that you didn't necessarily say. I might have just not heard it, and also it's just it made me it made me wonder about whether there's another emplotment that's more apt than either tragedy or farce, which would be like allegory, right? If a collective consciousness can't be depicted in its plenitude and diversity. So, those are some of the things that I was thinking about and then trying to formulate as a comment or question.
Yeah, I mean, as vis-a-vis, just to move backwards, I mean, vis-a-vis allegory, I mean, the whether or not, thereby one's kind of like committed to the whole Benjamin Tauschbild program or not, but just let me just think about allegory and the just, more, just the regular sense. I mean, there's a sense in which the revolution appears as an allegory of itself. It's acting like a personified abstraction, but also it's different from itself. I mean, the very need for its allegorization, or it's kind of what one might call when some might describe hostilely as its hypostatization, or it becomes a nominalized form or agent, which happens from the beginning. It's both a recognition that that history, there is something, there's an agency that is just more than the sum of individuals, and certainly more than a great leader. It's not the aggregate of individuals either, but that we often just kind of too easily, because it's trivialized by talking about a collective as if it was a thing, right? Or a kind of or collective consciousness as if it were a thing. I think it's a very, very difficult, it's a very difficult, talking about agency, scaling up agency in that way is really difficult. And I think the use of allegory, I think, is really useful here, an expression of that. So is that bound to loss? I think you're referring to some stuff towards the end of my talk, when I was just talking about this whole seeming reification, and how revolution, like this catastrophic of revolution as a lost object, in the sense of it takes on this ancestral quality that there's a loyalty and a fidelity and a sense of usurpation and betrayal and so on, which is what makes the Hamlet reference, I think, really speaks to that. How does it not just become this old king who's kind of commanding? How does it not become like a theological political trope of in fact ancestral plenitude in some sense? So so the loss would be, or the anxiety would be, inscribed in the very experience of collective action, that it might, it's already, is in the experience of the collective, is also a sense, I think, that what about tomorrow? And where is it, and how are we going to maintain it, and what, and then what about all the boring committees and everything else that takes place, like the day after the revolution? You got to do all the paperwork and all that stuff. Like so I think there's a sense of built into that is a sense that what exactly, how does one continue to formulate or express, articulate, and enjoy being a collective. So I think that's all that seems part of the seeming fetishism and nostalgia and melancholia, just kind of, that's all bundled into the idea of revolution in the first. I don't mean any of these things negatively. I'm kind of circling around your questions a little.
Another thing that occurred to me was, and this might just be some sort of fantasy that I have about your talk. But it's the way I'm relating it to your previous talk too, which is, if we think of, there was a hint about how this comes back and maybe compels us to reframe how we understand the dialectic, right? And that's why I got intrigued by the discussion about loss, because anyone who's ever heard a lecture on Aufhebung knows that it configures multiple ingredients, right? And there's always this idea that perhaps something does get lost, even though everything is held in suspense together in the third moment. And there's also like one of my professors at one point compared it to like Alka-Seltzer, where you put plop plop fizz fizz and then things go up, and some of the gas gets lost. But at some point you still have the solution. I mean, it's a little bit different because the Aufhebung keeps all the moments together sort of distinctly, and yet somehow there's nevertheless this potential for a kind of loss, or at least some people have argued that, right? About the Aufhebung. So
well, good thing too. I mean, if there wasn't that, which had that necessity of loss, I mean, not just potential, then it would be just magic.
Yeah.
I mean, it would just be plain old religion. I mean, in a bad sense.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also the way that, I think the Aufhebung also sort of models the way that certain kinds of writing operate, which is as a as a lot of figures that aren't necessarily connected to each other logically. The logic is in the figures, and the way that that logic gets made intelligible is through repetition. So like the use of a motif, right? Will make something seem like it has some sort of grounding or reality behind it. But if you were to parse it on a purely logical level, there's no necessarily, there's no cause and effect logic. There's no that really really connects the things that are being configured. These are just some of the random thoughts I was having. So it's not necessarily true that like there would be an answer that you're responsible for giving me. I was just curious about I just wanted to hear more about the idea of loss and whether there's a way of understanding it psychoanalytically and yet also rhetorically.
So can we wrap that discussion there, because we have questions from Rob Jackson and Charles Roger, and we're just about at 5:30.
Okay.
We'll continue, huh?
Yeah.
There's also office hours tomorrow, 11 a.m. So make another plug for that. So Rob, you have your hand up. I think you will be admitted to ask your question live.
I am admitted, yes. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt that conversation, Karen. I think my question kind of picks up maybe, or I hear some resonances there. So Rebecca, thank you so much for your talk. It helps me think about how to read. It also helps me think about some of the TV shows I've been watching over the pandemic and staging and two very popular shows, Succession and Yellowstone. I don't know if you've watched either of these, but they're both adaptations.
I certainly have. The other one I don't know.
Yellowstone is a weird King Lear set in Montana, contemporary Montana.
Oh, the Christian fundamentalists, that one. Those kind of Bible people.
Yeah, and cowboys. And my question is about kind of like what is at a basic level, these adaptations of tragedy in a time of counter-revolution. I think that was maybe the second moment of your talk, where it seems to me these highly popular shows are also coming at a time when there is immense amount of revolutionary potential from the left, or potency from the left and from the right, with all types of ambivalent violences, and not really a unified collective subject of revolution. And so this is maybe where it overlaps, Karen, with your question about loss. Whereas if revolution is the subject of tragedy, I think you suggested in your talk, and from my reading of Marx, capital is the subject of history.
And has a tragic kind of structure, right? It's
yes,
constantly going through the reversals, the falls, yeah.
Exactly. Then what happens to labor or the proletariat? How is the proletariat modified by the Lumpen and how is the Lumpen modified by the proletariat in this contemporary moment, when there seems to be no class consciousness, but an aspiration, maybe only, as the collective endnotes would say, for a consciousness of capital, and the aesthetic representation of that sort of consciousness as it relates to tragedy, and diffracted or fragmented collectivities on the left. I hope there's something in there that makes sense to you.
Right. Are you analogizing? So Marx is not the best, probably Marx himself, in terms of the stuff he said about the Lumpen proletariat, which he never exactly retracted. I mean, not remotely, is perhaps not the best person to go to help us with this. There've obviously been, very productive attempts, I mean, with there's so many, but I mean, I'm thinking about Fanon in particular right now, who I think would help. It would help think of a kind of subjectivity which doesn't have the. I think Marx is still really attached to the kind of metropolitan subject, which is the working class of Paris, right? That he's kind of he doesn't, he wants to extend it and eventually looks to another, but he doesn't really get beyond that model entirely. So what I was trying to do is to just push this in a direction that was, not proper Marx at all. So could and the question is, though, but that being said, the question of class consciousness is a little bit circular, because what I would also like to kind of emphasize is that it's not just that people don't have class consciousness and therefore they can't get up and have a revolution. I mean, circumstances themselves are so fragmenting. It's not because everybody's locked in individualism. It's because literally the workplace, there's no more workplace anymore. I mean,
yes, right. So I guess I'm more asking about what does that do? Kind of, I totally agree with that, and that makes a lot of sense to me. What does that do for maybe I would say like the staging of tragedy?
Right.
So how, if there's not and not even a desirable class that would overthrow capital, how does that change the way we think about the allotments?
Yeah, and I guess one way I would kind of also try to elaborate that question, or maybe it's a side question, is can we think of, is tragedy, can we think tragically without getting caught up in some kind of morbid, grandiose, nostalgic desire for, something that's, has had its day and is not working. So I'm thinking of Napoleon the First, the real Napoleon, when he was in his banishment, how did he spend his last days? He's just always doing is reading Greek tragedies and trying to kind of dictate his memoirs and make himself into a tragic hero. I mean, so this is the kind of, this is kind of obviously this regressive use of tragedy in order to kind of dignify. So can we, I would like to ask though, can we, because it seems to me, can we work with what's fundamental about tragedy, which is not about, the fall of great men or something like that, but actually does involve this detonation of a clash, which is, absolutely of let's call them parties, who are absolutely irreconcilable, and whose, and whose conflagration really makes an irreversible, it makes for history, it makes for a transition, which is fundamentally, something changes. So can we get something like that kind of conflict, which doesn't just splinter into local issues, doesn't only splinter into local issues. I mean, there still are local issues.
Okay, we're just about out of time.
Yeah.
Do you have a quick answer for Charles Roger?
What did Charles Roger say?
Who I think we'll be able to ask in person.
I'm happy to just read it. Hi. So I said, Adorno famously said that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. What about dialectic? Would it be possible to give a dialectical reading of the 20th century, unless of Auschwitz? And would it be tragedy, comedy, or farce, or what? And the danger, it would seem, of even attempting that would be to justify things, to make it necessary, even if just as a moment. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what are you trying to do with dialectics here? And how could this even work?
Right. And so, for Adorno, of course, dialectic was essential, but had to get qualified or had to become adjectival. Like it had to be negative dialectic. It couldn't be the dialectic anymore. It couldn't be the Hegelian or even the Hegelian Marxist dialectic because of, what Adorno considered to be its unexpungible complicity with grand totalizing, hyper metaphysical, hyper rationalist narratives, which are also real practices in the real world. And yet at the same time, I'm talking about Adorno, not myself right now, saw fit and saw necessary to retrieve and protect and work what could not be jettisoned, because the dialectic is the dialectic. Dialectical thinking is what makes it necessary and possible to think about, to think historically. So since you took us into Adorno, I kind of followed your movements here.
Yeah, I was more actually trying to push you towards I guess maybe Dowell and Fackenheim. So
oh
no. Run, don't walk.
Okay.
I don't think we have time for this.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wrap there because we're a little over time, actually. So I'd like to thank Rebecca for putting in an extra effort here and answering these many questions in an awkward format. I apologize for the format and the awkwardness, but we're kind of stuck with it. Let me just point out there's another lecture coming up on Monday. This is supposed to be the big lecture, the Town and Gown lecture. Don't look so surprised, Rebecca. It's supposed to be the lecture that bridges between the university and the larger community, but we'll see how that works on Zoom. And then there's a colloquium on temporality, which will be an interesting experiment next Friday, April 1st, which will bring together Rebecca and a bunch of local and formerly local scholars inspired by her work, commenting generally on the theme of temporality. And that will be a kind of packed house and an interesting opportunity for improvisation on the theme of temporality. And as I said, office hours tomorrow, if you still have questions, but register with Arts Events first. So thank you again, Rebecca, for a great talk and discussion. And
Thanks for
thank you
great
everyone for
questions.
coming.
Yeah.